Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
Boker Tov to all. Just to review where we are in our Tuesday morning Siddur class. I'm sorry that we skipped last week on short notice. I didn't look ahead in the calendar to realize it was Rosh Chodesh. So just to look at where we are, we will of course not meet next Tuesday because it will be Purim. And then we have 4 weeks between Purim and Pesach. So God willing, I will plan on meeting all 4 of those weeks. And we started last time talking about a group of thinkers. They're all rabbis. They all happen to be nominally conservative rabbis, who we refer to them as limited theists. Limited theism, meaning they believe in God, but in a limited sort of way. And we started with Milton Steinberg. We're going to finish, I hope, Milton Steinberg today. We'll do a little bit of review since we skipped a week. And then we'll have 4 more weeks between Purim and Pesach, and I hope to do maybe 2 weeks on Harold Kushner and 2 weeks on Harold Schulweis. And that would be nice if we could finish limited theism before Pesach, and then we'll start some other people after Pesach. So that's where we're at. Okay? So we're talking about this group of people who some people have referred, I don't think this is an official term, and it's certainly not a term they would have embraced, I think. But people who can be named limited theists. Again, they're all students of Kaplan who basically, if I can summarize just to look at the bottom, they basically accept Kaplan's human centrism, okay, but they reject Kaplan's total anti-supernaturalism. They are more or less supernaturalists, which is to say they believe that there's a God of the universe, that God is real, okay, but God is not going to answer your prayers and go poof. Or I should say it the other way around. God is not going to go poof and answer your prayers in any direct supernatural kind of way. And that's how they are limited theists. So I'm going to kind of reread what we read last time because we sort of stopped in the middle. And I'm going to reread quickly. Again, this is from a book that collects various Jewish thinkers. Okay. Rifat Sonsino is the editor, Reform rabbi, who says, again, the core of this idea is that God's powers are limited. Hashem exists, and Hashem's powers are limited. Okay? So God, he starts out with some concepts that would be familiar to us from Rambam. We cannot know God completely. Sorry, for those who are looking at home, I'm on page 100. The highlighted, we cannot know God completely. At the essence of God, what God is in God's self, we can only guess. And of God's manifestations or works, we comprehend only that shred which our senses can grasp and mind conceive. Meaning we can't really know anything about God. Okay? All we have is the shreds of what our mind can grasp. This would be, any medieval Jewish theologian, Rambam and the like, would totally agree with that sentence. So how do we know that God exists? It's a conclusion of an act of faith. For like all other propositions, the proposition of the existence of God is not completely provable. It is an act of faith. Okay? And he says it makes the most sense. Why? Page 101 here before me unfolds a universe which is dynamic, creative, and rational, in the sense that everything in it in the universe conforms to the law of its own being. A world that has produced in living things, that's us, what seems to be purposiveness, let's say a simpler word, purpose, and in humans, consciousness. The theory which fits the existence of the world best is that there is, now he has several, he's got 5 words that he capitalizes as, I would call it, epithets or metaphors for God. Here are 2 of them. in this top paragraph on page 101. Thought will, okay? Thought will, which he makes into a hyphenated word, but they're both capitalized. That's like straight up Rambam, right? Rambam is consciousness, right? The ultimate consciousness, which exists outside the universe, and it's a will. It's a thought, it's a will. And then in the next paragraph down, he has another hyphenated word, mind, energy, and then spirit. Okay? So what is God? How does he understand God? Is a capitalized thought, will, mind, energy, spirit. 5, I would call them euphemisms or epithets or alternative terms for what God is. Or to use the older and better word, God. He says, okay, this is our plain old Jewish, old-fashioned word for it. Other people may think of it as thought, or, the word we usually use instead of thought is consciousness, right? That's what Rambam would say. Intellect. God is an intellect, pure intellect outside the universe. Zohar would certainly say, Jewish mysticism would certainly say will. God is a will. Okay. 21st century Californians would say energy. Okay. 20th century Californians would say spirit. Okay. So what is God? Yeah, God is a process, a spirit, and energy. Okay. So he says, okay, yeah, it's all those things. We call it God. We have this shorthand name for it, God, a name of some Scandinavian deity, which becomes a placeholder name for this concept, right? And we have, of course, in Hebrew, all sorts of words that we say in the Siddur that are placeholder names for this concept, right? El, Elohim, Hashem, right? God's 4-letter name. These are all just placeholder names for this idea that there is fundamentally a mind, consciousness, an energy, a spirit, a will, which does what? That's the limited theism. What does it do? So we'll get to that. Okay? We have a couple more words. Being, capitalized. Power, capitalized. Okay? So we have a variety of English words, concepts. They're all different concepts, right? Energy is different than mind. But he says these are all ways of understanding what we call God. Okay, so what is God? This God. This is what makes him a theist. What does God do? So God is purposive and ethical. This is where it would not be, let's say, a pure scientific view of God that, the universe, we're here because of random events. So he would disagree with that. God is purposive and ethical. Ethical, another word for moral. Okay? But God is not all powerful. And this is where, up until now, we would say, okay, everything up until this sentence is sort of just restatement of traditional Jewish views. Nothing new here, right? You want to call it energy instead of calling it intelligence or consciousness. What's the difference? These are all just word concepts to try to understand what God is like, okay, instead of the shorthand personal term, God. Okay, so here is the first place in our thinking where he gets off the train with traditional Jewish theology. God is not all powerful. Why is God not all powerful? Okay, God is self-limiting. So the power has chosen to self-limit. That's why I wrote in the margin tzimtzum. God chooses to take a step back. Why? Because God gives us free will. Okay? God gives us free will. Therefore, God chooses to limit God's power. Again, I will remind you, we said this last week. Pirkei Avot says, Hakol tzafui v'harashut netuna. Everything is foreseen by God, meaning God is omniscient, and yet you have free choice about what you're going to do in the next moment. That's a paradox. He says, he changes that paradox. He doesn't talk about God's omniscience, but he does say God has taken a step back. You have free will, meaning God is limited in power. God is not omnipotent. This is where he's different than medieval, traditional, classical Jewish theology. Why is God not omnipotent? Not because God can't, right? We'll see he's going to be different than some of the other limited theists we'll read in the next few weeks. Not because God can't, but God chooses not to. Because God chooses, God is like a judge who recuses themselves. Okay, God says, I don't adjudicate any of these human things. I've given them free will. Top of page 102, if a person is to have real freedom, God's control cannot be complete. Okay, this is where we left off. God is indubitably the power of rationality, of design, of order, of meaningfulness, of creativity, meaning God arranged all of this stuff in the universe, yet traditional conceptions of God are somehow inadequate to deal with the problem of evil. Now we're going to step off, this is, I think, what I said last time we stopped here, and this is not a class in general on how we understand the problem of evil in the world, okay? But all three of these limited theists feel that it is important to deal with the problem of evil. Certainly, Kushner and Schulweis are post-Holocaust thinkers, right? So post-Holocaust thinkers really need to think about the problem of evil. I believe Steinberg died, I think, in 1950. So I'm not sure when he wrote this stuff. Again, he died in his late 40s. In his 40s, life was cut short. He wrote 2 or 3 major books, and surely he would have written much more and become he'd be on our map more as a Jewish thinker had he not died young. Okay, now we're going to evil, and then we're going to get to prayer. Limited theists, Steinberg included, argue, this is our editor speaking, not Steinberg, right? Limited theists, Steinberg included, argue that nature is in the process of evolving according to God's will to higher and better levels. However, in each species of the universe, there are some lower levels of development. Okay? Here's a quote. Evil represents the survival into the human condition of other lower stages of reality, mineral, vegetable, and animal, out of which humanity has emerged and on which humanity stands. I sort of maybe understand that. That which we call evil is a vestige of lower aspects of what we would call evolution. Let's talk about human evil, okay? Why is there human evil? Because humans contain within them rivalry, greed, the tendency to otherize other people and say, we're human, they are less than human, therefore we can do anything to them. All right? Why does that exist? Because this is some vestige of a lower level of development. All right? So he's saying that whereas, let us say, in some thinking in Kabbalah, evil is a quasi-independent force that is always there that needs to be vanquished, a quasi-independent metaphysical force. God is always struggling with evil in some, Gnostic or dualistic views, which have some vestiges in Kabbalah. Here he says, no. Evil is a vestige of a lower level of development. It is the persistence. By the way, I wrote a question mark here because I don't understand this paragraph. It is the persistence of the circumstances of lower strata in higher, the carryover of the limitations of the orders of being on which humanity's existence is based, right? The carryover into the human personality and society. I guess he might say, this is an animalistic aspect of humans. Although I'd have to say, as we know, as lots of people have said, no, animals don't do what humans do to each other, right? Humans are much more violent and cruel to each other than animals are. Animals kill for food and for defensiveness and for territory. Michael, can you hold on a moment? Okay. Or said another way, another sentence I don't fully understand, it is the still evil, is the still unremoved scaffolding of the edifice of God's creativity. It is the still unremoved scaffolding. I don't know. I'm trying to translate this into my terms. You know, we have a human drive to be a group and to take care of each other. That's what causes me to privilege my group above other groups. And that might privilege us to say our group is the true chosen group. Those people are less than human. And so the moral rules that we apply within our group do not apply to what I can do to them. That is an unremoved scaffolding. So, or it is something of a lower strata, the limitations of a lower order of being. Michael, I want you to hold questions. So the advantage, top of page 103, our editor says, the advantage of recognizing the reality of evil as part of the makeup of the universe, and particularly as part of nature that has not yet been conquered, enables us to not assign blame to God. That's the punchline, right? We don't say the Shoah. Even though we say the second temple was destroyed because it was God's punishment because of sinat chinam, baseless hatred, we don't say, except if you have a particular Haredi theology, we don't say God chose to bring the Shoah upon us. Okay? If you do have a traditional Haredi theology, you do say that, right? It's no less explainable than the destruction of the first temple, the destruction of the second temple. It's just one more disaster that God has allowed to be loosed upon us to teach us a lesson. Okay? So in this limited theology, don't blame it on God. Young person dies tragically of cancer, don't blame it on God, right? So suffering and actual human evil they stem from, air quotes, lower aspects of creation that have not yet been vanquished. An actual quote from Milton Steinberg. The concept of irrational evil prevents us from ascribing to God that which probably should not be ascribed to God. God is exempted. This is a very important sentence. God is exempted, not from the struggle, but from the responsibility for the elements of chance within God's universe. Person gets sick and dies because of the elements of chance, who the bacteria attack, and the antibiotics can't hold the bacteria back. Okay, that's chance. It's not God's fault. So it's different than the classical Talmudic view of God decides to visit suffering on specific individuals. Okay, and here he talks in the discourse about chance, but I would argue about human evil. It's elements of human impulses. Okay. Thus, for example, if there was a tragedy, we do not say that it was brought about by God, but that it happened because of the lower levels of development within the universe. Okay, now we're not quoting. How does one? This, of course, leaves the problem, right? Here's the problem punchline. Who cares? Who wants to worship a God like that? Who can't do anything? Who chooses not to, quote unquote, do anything? How is this different from deism, right? The watchmaker set the watch and walked away, right? And doesn't choose to do anything now. So why am I saying to God, please heal this sick person? What's the point of that? We're going to look at what Steinberg says about that in a moment, right? But here's the question that it leaves. How does one relate to a God who is not all powerful, but all good? Kushner's quotes are from When Bad Things Happen to Good People. Okay. So if God doesn't cause the bad things, what power does God have? And therefore, what's the point? of us wanting to say, I believe in God and I worship God and I daven? What's the point of that? Okay, he's going to address that in a moment. I'm going to stop sharing because I'm going to share a different document, but I will pause for Michael's question.
Is the theory that society in general has not evolved beyond a stage that would allow it to extinguish evil, or is it talking about individual people?
I don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know if he addressed that. I think we could answer that question by saying, well, it's both. Society's made up of individual people, and some individual people, let's spin it out. Being compassionate to all beings is a higher form of being human, and being compassionate to all beings has not yet fully vanquished the impulse of my group is superior, therefore your group is subhuman, therefore we can do anything to you. We can put you in gas chambers or cages or chop your head off or incinerate you with some gun that shoots into the safe room and immediately everything is heated to 2,000 degrees, which is kind of how some of those, how did everything get burned on October 7th, right? And I don't mean to say that human atrocities are on one side and not on another side. There are plenty of human atrocities to go around. So is it the individual? Is it the group? I think, if you were kind of a social psychologist, you'd probably have some theory about it's both. It's individuals, and then certain individuals sway the group, and there's a group psychology, I think. Okay. Not everyone got to be an SS officer. People were selected to be SS officers because they had certain capabilities, let's call it, that other people didn't. Something that, I always want to ask people like our local expert, Rabbi Professor Michael Berenbaum, how did these people do this? How did they choose these people? Okay. Could any ordinary person have done that? I think the answer is, certain things any ordinary person can do and certain things any ordinary person can't do, right? And certain people are selected for their cruelty. It's not that far away from our American headlines of the last few weeks. Certain people are selected for their cruelty. Okay, Larry?
First of all, you would be the right person to ask about that, not Michael Berenbaum, given your training. But that wasn't my simple question is, did I miss something? Or do any of these authorities define evil?
In various places, yes. And I think I said last week, and I'll say it again. Generally, what's called evil, there's two kinds of things, really, that we really need to divide, I think. One is human suffering, okay? And the other is human cruelty to other humans. Because there's a whole category of human suffering, like tragically a child has cancer and dies, which we would say probably, God forbid, which we would say probably, that's not because a human being was cruel. Okay, that just happened because cancer just happens. Although I don't know if cancer just happens because there's
Roundup
pesticide schmutz in the food, right? Then it's a very it's an answer that's somewhere in between number one and number two. But yeah, we would say there's a difference between suffering. Everyone dies. Okay, so that's suffering. That's a subcategory of evil. Okay, or one might call it that. Okay, and most people don't die peacefully in their sleep without a wisp of aging or pain. Right? Most people have some suffering before they die. So that's one branch of evil, and I think they would call that natural evil or nature's evil. And I think these thinkers would say, that's just the chance evil that happens because of how nature is organized. Okay. And then there's the human inflicted evil. So I think they would distinguish between those two things. Does that answer your question? And so when you say evil, this is evil that someone died, what do you mean by that? I'm not asking you. I'm just saying one will always say, oh, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like someone got a sickness and they died young and they left children behind, which is suffering and it's bad, but it's because of nature. They got sepsis. They didn't make it to the emergency room in time. The antibiotics didn't work. I just heard a story like that the other day. Okay. So that's evil, but it's not because one human being decided to inflict suffering on another human being. It's a different.
I understand. I understand it. I'm not trying to debate it.
Yeah.
The Kushner's bad things
Yes.
isn't necessarily, depending how you define it, a question of evil. But we're talking about evil as if evil is self-evident. And I've had some recent discussions with my wife and amongst other people where it's not clear that evil is self-evident. So you probably don't want to go there. I was just wondering if any of these, if Steinberg or Kushner or anybody spends any time defining them. Actually defining what is evil and what's not evil, and
Don't know.
Okay.
And I'm not digging. I'm sure they do. I'm not digging too deeply into it because I want to stick to Siddur. But it's a good question. Great question. Okay. I want to share a second text. So what does this have to do with prayer? Alan, go ahead first.
Yeah. This dichotomy between God's omnipotence and God's beneficence, good. If you get rid of one of them, then you don't have any religious issues. If you say that God isn't all-powerful, then you can understand everything else happens. Say that God is not beneficent, why do you want to pray to a God who's not going to be beneficent? So this whole thing of what we're going on with evil, it seems like the only way that it makes any sense, the way that I'm hearing it right now in these discussions with these scholars and theologians, is that God is not all-powerful, that there's going to be, the Holocaust happens, 2-year-olds die of cancer, there could be no real justification for things like that.
Correct. I think you just restated them. Was there a question, or you're saying that works?
It seems to me that's how it works.
Okay. Yeah. I generally agree with you. They're saying this is what makes sense to me. I refuse to believe that God is responsible for those things. Therefore, I say there is God. God is loving. The things in the world, in the universe that seem to be not loving are not things that are done by God. That is how they square the circle. God is beneficent. But again, I'm just raising the question. I just want to push it a little further and say, okay, well, then what does beneficent actually really mean? Okay? You can't do for me what I'd like you to do for me, God. Yeah, you can't heal that sick person. So what good is beneficence? This is what he's going to address. I want to let him address it. Hold on, Michael. I want to let him address it. Okay. This is in basic Judaism. All right. This starts out sounding like Heschel. Prayer is the bridge between the human and God. With the intellect, one figures out what God is and also something of what God must be. In intuition, one experiences God. In revelation, one receives testimony concerning God. In the good life, by which he means the moral life, one charts a course by God's light. In ritual, one celebrates God. But only in prayer does one establish a soul-to-soul interchange with him. Prayer then consists in two elements, that a soul shall be oriented toward God, and that whether with words or not, the soul addresses God. Okay? So now he's talking about prayer, and it could be something from Heschel, except Heschel would say it more poetically. Okay. Now I'm skipping. You can read this at home, down to the efficacy of prayer, meaning what good does it do? Yes, Michael.
I would say that by God willingly ceding power, that leaves open the possibility of efficacy of prayer, because you can either explicitly or implicitly be asking God to not withdraw quite so much in this.
Got it. Yes. Right. And Again, I want to take us back to Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who said 3 stages, right? He said stage 1, God used to do miracles. Stage 2, partnership. Stage 3, Tzimtzum, I have withdrawn. It's all up to you people. Yes, so you're saying we could appeal to the court and say, couldn't you please step in? I think in their system, Michael, God won't do that. Or maybe. Now, by the way, now this selection is from Basic Judaism. Basic Judaism is a book that Steinberg wrote to be an intro to Judaism for, prospective converts or people who didn't know a lot. So in this book, he's not just the quote we're reading now. He's not just talking about his own theology. He's trying to give a broader view of different Jewish theologies. So we'll see him address what Michael just said. So the efficacy of prayer. But what, according to Jewish tradition, is the efficacy of prayer? Bottom of page 3. Does it avail? Does prayer work? That God responds to prayer is a basic belief of Judaism. On the extent of the response, the Jewish faithful disagree, some being optimists or maximalists on the issue, and others, if not pessimists, are at least circumspect or minimalist. So does God answer prayer? Some people are maximalists, some people are minimalists. Okay. Given the right use, prayer may, I'm highlighted on page 4, prayer may, in the Jewish view, achieve the following. May. Number 1, it can first of all, and on this all religious Jews are agreed, release pent-up feelings, crystallize inarticulate thoughts, muster the will, and all in all prove of great psychological worth. Meaning, Tefillah gave you an opportunity to feel better psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually because you expressed what you needed to express. It can further, and on this too there is general assent, tap levels of personality otherwise not to be reached, setting free the full resources of the spirit. I have no idea what that means. Again, I think this means something like what Heschel and Rav Kook are talking about in terms of let's say you're reaching deeper into your soul and letting your soul connect to the soul of the world. Okay? On why prayer possesses this peculiar potency, the circumspect and the optimist differ. The former, the circumspect, which is a fancy word, he means the minimalist, contend that the process is purely naturalistic, being the very normal response of the individual human's psyche to an idea as compelling as that of God. Meaning, the minimalists, who he refers to as more circumspect on the efficacy of prayer, say, this is about you. Davening is about you and your relationship to God. It's not about God might actually do anything in response to your prayer. The latter, that's the maximalists, holding that they are far bolder, holding that in prayer, the human is inundated by the divine, an experience quite beyond natural law and not to be accounted for by it. All religious Jews agree next that prayer exerts an influence on things outside us. But once again, there's disagreement on the how. The minimalists maintain that prayer sways the physical world only through human agencies. The maximalists insist that quite apart from man, it impinges directly as reality, meaning God might heal the sick. I'm going to near the end of the next paragraph. Super maximalists, as they may be called, contend that nature is but a tool in Hashem's hand. Nothing then can be impossible, not even a miracle. So he's saying, yes, he's writing an intro book. He's not saying whether he agrees to this or not. He's saying, yes, there are people within the Jewish tradition who say God can make a miracle. You can pray for a miracle because God can do that. So he's reporting faithfully that there are those people within the tradition. At the same time, there are people in the tradition who say prayer only changes you and your environment, not God. Okay, here's his summary. Again, he's being a faithful reporter. He's not telling you what he believes in the book Basic Judaism. Religious Jews, it should be clear by now, run a wide gamut in their evaluation of prayer. please pay attention now, it remains to be pointed out that while the rule is not absolute, most traditionalists are maximalists, meaning most Jews who would describe themselves as I am traditional, they are maximalists. They believe that God can do miracles, and so you pray for someone to be healed because God might choose to hear your prayers and heal the sick person. Most modernists are minimalists. Most people who define themselves as I'm a modern Jewish thinker, and from what we've read, it's clear that Steinberg would define himself that way, are more towards the circumspect or minimalist camp. Prayer is an act that changes you. Prayer is an act that might connect your soul to God if you're kind of a spiritual modernist, okay? But prayer is not something that changes what God does, okay? So in Basic Judaism, which is an Intro to Judaism book, okay, Steinberg is reporting on the range of beliefs about what prayer is for. That's why I brought this into our Siddur class. And he's saying, in Judaism, there's a range of beliefs. The ones who tend to define themselves as modernist thinkers tend to be minimalists in terms of their belief that prayer affects the God realm. It's more about affecting you, affecting the human realm, and helping you feel connected to God. But I'm not going to I'm not going to get God to do anything different. He says, yeah, there are traditionalists who basically believe the traditional beliefs, which is that, you pray to Hashem and Hashem can decide to do things or not do things. A traditional Jewish belief. Okay, I'm going to pause. We have 4 minutes. I want to finish by 9. Larry and then others. And then next week, not next week, in 2 weeks after Purim, we'll move on to, I think, Harold Kushner. Go ahead, Larry. Unmute. You have to unmute.
My simple question is, did Steinberg enter into dialogue at all with Kaplan? And while you're thinking of it, I'm sitting here with my copy of Basic Judaism that I'm noticing my father inscribed in 1964. Mm-hmm. So I'm feeling very connected right now.
Very sweet. Very sweet. Yes. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the explicit answer. Did he, there's an implicit answer. The implicit answer is all three of these thinkers were students of Kaplan. Okay. They're all, I'll say again what I said at the beginning. They are all Kaplanian. Again, I said anyone who's a modern Jewish thinker has to respond to Kaplan one way or the other. Kaplan said, it's all about humans. It's all about science. It's all about nature. You're praying to something out there. You're whistling in the dark. There's nothing out there. Okay. And that which we label God is that's a placeholder for the highest expression of human moral and spiritual striving. It's a label for what that we invent for what we do. It's not a thing out there. It's not a reality out there. There is no supernatural reality. These three thinkers, including Steinberg, were all students of Kaplan's. They're all Kaplanians in the sense that they emphasize what humans are doing. Okay? They're in disagreement with Kaplan in that they disagree with the statement, there's nothing out there. There is something out there. However, all of our religious drive and practice and whatever is not about trying to have influence with what's out there, but rather, and by the way, there are different reasons why we don't. So his answer of why is we can't have influence because God has recused God's self. Okay? It's very interesting. I don't know if he knew any Kabbalah or implicit Kabbalah or something, because people, because JTS rabbis didn't study Kabbalah back then in the 30s and 40s, right? But he basically talks about Tzimtzum. God has recused God's self from these kinds of actions, okay? But there is a reality out there, a supernatural reality, and we can try to connect to it, okay? But it's just us connecting to it. It's not that we should have any assurance that it is going to do anything because we asked nicely, okay? So, when time to time, Israelis declare there's a fast day because of some threat and people are going to daven and gather together and daven and hundreds and thousands at the Kotel. He would say, okay, that's not because God is going to make a different choice of what to do in the future. God's not going to be the one choosing. Humans are the ones choosing. It could be a good thing because it helps put all our expressions and feelings together, and that might help change or affect what humans choose to do. But it's not going to change or affect what God chooses to do. And again, this takes us back to, I think it's a very good term that our editor that we read, Sansino, coined, limited theism, partial theism. There's a supernatural reality out there, okay, but it's not going to act in our world. Now, by the way, we're going to read Kushner and we're going to read Schulweis, right, between Purim and Pesach, and you might end up saying, they don't say anything new beyond what he said, okay? I think, Steinberg would have been the thinker of his era had he lived another 30 years and written more, okay? He ended up kind of not really being the thinker of his era because he died young. And, there was the great era of, Jewish publishing starting in the 60s, going on to into the 70s onwards of books, everyone publishing books. So, and lecturers lecturing. And now we have, you don't even have to travel. They can do it on Zoom. So we've lived the last few decades in a great era of Jewish, I will say, public sharing of wisdom and abilities for us to learn wisdom. It used to be, you had to own a manuscript of something, right, to learn wisdom 800 years ago. But first there were books, then there was travel and lectures, and then there was Zoom. All right. So I think this is a kind of thinking most people will associate more with Kushner and Schulweis. But when we read them, I think you'll say, might say, they didn't say anything new that Milton Steinberg did not say once and briefly. And they said it, longer and in longer books that more people read. So part of why I started with him is I think he doesn't quite get the credit that he deserves in terms of kind of being a pioneer of this kind of thinking. Okay, let's wrap it up. Be happy. It's Adar. Have a Freilich Purim, and God willing, we'll meet again in 2 weeks.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.